We ended the lecture talking about the warrior class. I was discussing how this entire class is really just built up to engage in this warfare. That we don't see our, the peasants who work in the field and the shepherds. They're not the ones who are engaging in warfare. It's a specially trained group of warriors that do so. I was mentioning the type of weapons that they use. We talked about spears, axes, swords. I don't know if anyone remembers me talking about the swords where they had the hilt that was like the animal's mouth, which I just think is so interesting. And I've been looking for pictures, and if I can find one, I'll definitely post it in the next PowerPoint. But just a really interesting image. If you don't have gold to ornament your sword, at least you can get the jaw of a big fish, which is just really cool. But I was also talking about the use of armor in battle, and we don't really see the Irish using iron or metal armor until after the Norman invasion. Even though the Irish had engaged in warfare with the Vikings, and so obviously were influenced by them. The only armor we see Irish using before the 11th century is kind of boiled leather, so hardened leather that they wear as a chest plate, and then they attach with leather thongs to their back. And then they do have like leather greaves that they put on their legs for protection, but not a lot of armor. We do see images of them wearing helmets, and they are discussed carrying large round shields that many had thought was a carryover from the Vikings, but there's evidence of them using round shields long before the Vikings came. Like the early Christians mentioned this. So we know that this was something that they used before the Vikings came. But it's interesting to see kind of those cultural connections and the, not only do we see language being shared, but, ways of fighting are shared as well. Um, but that is where we ended yesterday. And so we are going to start with our next privileged class, which is known as the Os Dana. They are the people of art. So this is the learned, privileged classes. And I know it might sound strange to think that, the ancient Irish civilizations had an entire class of people when we don't hear of universities or schools or that sort. But the people of the art includes, art skills such as blacksmiths or pottery, things like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that you learn in a school. I mean, it obviously also includes, doctors and judges and that sort of things, but not all of that is is learned in a school. It can be learned throughout a lifetime. So this special class, the Os Dana, the people of art, are really an interesting group. They share special skills or knowledge that is of value to the Irish society. And as I mentioned, you can see this with smiths, artists, academics, doctors, judges, musicians, and so forth. And so there's varying degrees within each of these subfields that range from a student to a master, and they're recognized that way. And in fact, their honor price is based on where they fall within their subfield. And so when someone has reached the highest level within their field, they're known as an olave. It kind of sounds like the word olive, but it's spelled with an A, olaves. And this means that not only have they achieved the highest level of skill, but also their lineage matches their level of skill, their formal training is at their height, and that their personal talent is also this, they have a flair for their craft. And so it's not just that they've studied the longest. It matters where they came from, who their family is, where they got their training from, and what their personal flair is. So I'm going to talk about three particular professions within the Ais Dana, because these are the ones that are valued the most within Irish society. So on the slide over here, I've got the first one, and these are known as the Filiads. The Filiads are traveling poets. They're storytellers. They're the oral historians of Irish society. And remember what I said yesterday, that the Irish don't have a recognized written language until Christianity comes and creates one for them. And so someone who is an oral historian is extremely important, because that's how the history of their people is told. So that's one of the reasons why they're one of the top they're valued almost at the top of society. The next ones I want to talk about are the Brehons. Now, these are the judges and experts on Brehon law. So they know Irish law, and Irish law is really important, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. And our third category are our musicians. They're the crouters. These are the harpists. The Filiads are welcome in every household. They provide a vivid form of entertainment, as well as I said before, preserving and passing on history, religion, morals, sort of this shared knowledge of the community. When I think of early Irish Filiads, I think of Homer, where he's passing on this oral history of the ancient Greeks. This is kind of the same thing. In fact, Filiads are so revered within early Irish society that their honor price. So if they're harmed in some way, the way for someone to make up for that within Brehon law is that their honor price that has to be paid is the same as a low-level king. So a poet has the same honor price as a king. And that shows us a lot about the amount of value that's placed on these traveling poets. They're really, really revered. In fact, I'll mention this next week when we talk about St. Patrick, but St. Patrick almost takes on the, not appearance, but the attitude of a Filiad and sort of travels around Ireland when he's converting people in that same way, because he recognizes that they're such a revered person within society. So not only do they have this honor price, but they are welcomed into every household, and every household feels an obligation to welcome them, because you don't want a Filiad to speak poorly of you, because they are so revered that anything they say about you will be taken very seriously by other people. And so you want to make sure that your local Filiad thinks highly of you. So it's an interesting new way of thinking about these poets, these oral historians. So I want to talk a little bit more about the cruter, who are the harpists, the musicians. They are also very greatly valued within society. They hold the highest honor price of all of the musical arts that existed in Ireland at this time. The fine for even damaging a fingernail of a harpist is recorded in Brehon law. So that just shows how important their hands are, obviously, to their craft. And one of the reasons why they're so important is that a harpist is really one of the instruments that can travel easily. Oftentimes a harpist is traveling with a Filiad and accompanying those oral stories and that poetry with music. And so it kind of goes hand in hand. So there's three types of music that these crouters learn as they're enhancing their knowledge. The first type is the Gol Triga, which is the type of music that induces tears. And then we have the Gent Triga, which is that induces joy. And then we have the Su Entrega, which induces sleep. And so there's these three styles of music that each harpist, each cruter would have to master to reach the higher levels of his art. And I think we all appreciate music, and so we appreciate these different levels that they care about. So the local Ri, depending on the size of the Tua, the size of his community of people that he rules over, he would generally keep an expert in each of these fields. He would have his own Olave of each of these professions at his court. So this would be a Filiad, a harpist, a physician, a Brehon, builders, that sort of thing. And so the king would pay to have these people live at his court. They were paid a financial stipend, and then they were usually given a certain amount of land in which to cultivate and to grow their own family on. I'm going to not talk about the Brehons just yet, because I have a section on Brehon law a little bit later. So I'm going to talk about our next rank of society now, and that is the society of sewers. The sewer, I know it sounds bad, but the sewers are free, high-ranking commoners. So these are the people who have control over land. It's not really an idea of ownership per se at this time, but they had recognized control over a certain territory of farming land. as well as they would pasture cattle, sheep, pigs, that sort of thing. And then our lowest order of person within Irish society are the doer. These are unfree people. They are dependent on those above them for the land that they work. These people aren't considered slaves, and they're not to be sold. They're not attached to the land, but they are dependent on others for land to them farm to sustain themselves and their families. There aren't really slaves in early Ireland in the sense that we think of with the Roman Empire or with ancient Greece or even with antebellum South American, not South American, but the American South. But they're more like serfs in the way that we think about feudal society in early European, the Middle Ages, that time period, where they're kind of just dependent on those above them. They're not necessarily servants, but they're dependent on others. It's a little bit complicated. There are a lot of laws in Bran law that deal with doers, and then there are some societies that have actual slaves, but that's not super common at this time period in Irish history. When the Vikings come, we see slavery being introduced a little bit more, and we'll talk about that more in a couple of weeks. I do want to mention a little bit about women as well. First and foremost, a woman's status is dependent on the premier male in her life. So if she's married, her status is dependent on that status of her husband. Or if she's unmarried or divorced, it would be on either her father or whoever is the leading male within her family. Women are not excluded from work. They are allowed to educate themselves as part of the Aes Dana. They can rise up as academics within certain traits. They can be physicians, they can be druids, some actually even trained to be fighters, but they are still considered lesser than men on that scale. It is still, it is still sort of a patriarchal society, but they do have a lot more freedom than women in other societies at these time periods. I mentioned before about divorce law that ensures a certain amount of responsibility and taking care of a woman after she's been divorced. There's also laws that deal with if a woman is seeking a divorce for false reasons and she won't get the things that she wants if it's not based on society's acceptable or the things that Irish society find acceptable reasons for divorce. But women are definitely of a higher status here than, say, ancient Greece at this time period. So we're going to move on to our next PowerPoint slide here, and we are going to talk a little bit more about Bran law. So all of the men of the Tuatha owe the king loyalty. They owe their loyalty. And he, in turn, what he gives them is that he acts as their appointed representative in all of the matters concerning the Tuatha and its neighbors. So the other Tuathas and the other Rees in the area. The king never really has executive command over the Tuatha. It is definitely a limited monarchy system. So what really does rule within these Irish Tuathas is the law code. It's this Bran law code, which is independent and above the kings. And the kings are subject to the law like everyone else. Originally, Bran law was written down in the 6th to 7th centuries. But we know it goes far back in their history based on oral tradition. And the members of the Aes Dana, the Brahans, these are the judges and the arbiters of the law. They are also the people who memorize the law that it has been passed down to. So they're able to act as arbiters, act as mediators in a variety of circumstances. And they're trained extensively throughout their lifetime in Bran law. Now, there's 3 types of law specifically. There's many other types of law that sort of fit into these aspects. And so there's 3 types I'm going to talk about today. The first one is finicus, which are the laws and customs of the free farming classes. And so this deals with a lot of property issues of the main elements of society. The second type of law is the filiocht, which are the customs and laws of the Philly. So our traveling poets, this deals with the rules of poetry, the passing on of this knowledge, and the fact that there is an entire section of law devoted to this should again explain how important these Philiads are considered within society. And then we have the Bre Halil, which is the canon law. And it is believed that this type of law concerned laws and customs pertaining to the Druids, but then it also ended up getting mixed a little bit with Christianity, which is why they use the term canon law in the description. So this one is a little less clear, and I'm not going to discuss it too much because I don't have a lot of clarity on it. But I just want you to know that there were laws dealing with poets, dealing with religion, and then dealing with the society itself. Brand law worked through a system of pledges and bindings using an individual's honor price. We don't have prisons, we don't have jails. And so to deal with that, to deal with punishment, that's why this system of pledges and bindings is so important. And as a way of avoiding blood feuds that could go on for centuries, this idea of an honor price is put into place. So if a person is injured in some way, the person that injures them has to pay whatever that person's honor price is in relation to whatever the type of injury it was. So I had mentioned earlier that if a harpist's finger or their fingernail is even damaged, that there is a price that someone has to pay. And that is how order is maintained within the society. If a person refuses to comply with a law or the judgment made by a Brean, they risk being ostracized from their society, from their tua, or even being declared an outlaw. And that, I know we kind of think of, Robin Hood when we think of outlaws, but being declared an outlaw essentially means that you are beyond the protection of your tua. So your clan no longer will protect you. And that means you can be harmed by anyone else, that there's no repercussions for that. And that can be a dangerous place to live, especially if you have a family that you need to support. Social status is very important within Brean law, and Brean law really shows us how hierarchical the social structure of Ireland is. The status is very important, and the payment, someone's honor price, is actually paid in heads of cattle, because we don't have a form of currency, we don't have coins, we don't have a form of monetary currency at this time. And so cattle is the most important commodity in Ireland, and that is how this honor price is paid out. There's also bartering and trade that happen, and goods in exchange, and there's lesser elements with honor price. I'm sure a sheep probably is valued at less than a cattle, but because cattle herds are so important, that's how this is based in. These Brean laws are really in place to preserve the peace within a tua. So if a crime is committed, instead of the retaliation happening, as I mentioned, those blood feuds, these laws lay out so that reparations can be paid to a family that has been wronged in cattle, depending on the severity of the crime and the status of the individual involved. So if a king is harmed in some way, not killed, but if some harm is done to his body, the price for that would be about 49 heads of cattle. So again, that's very expensive. And to think a Philiad is worth that same amount. A traveling poet is worth 49 heads of cattle if they're harmed. So this elaborate system of law was actually still in place in some parts of Ireland up until the 16th century. It's amazing to see how long these Brean laws have been in use. Beyond law, there are other ways that the society is run. So we have the king, we have the Ree, and then we have Brean laws, but we do also have a sort of people's assembly, a gathering of elders that would meet, and they would sort of help the king, the local king, make decisions that would affect the entire tua. They would also help adjudicate in certain legal issues, or they would act as a jury in a case. The revenue of the king or the ruling chief is is not necessarily levied taxes so much, but the money that a king gets to sort of support his court and to pay his nobles to go to war with him, is he's allowed a certain amount of land during his lifetime. And based on the size of the tua, that determines the size of the tract of land that the king is given for the time period that he's king. And the king's other form of revenue is individual payments that he gets from his warrior class families, from farmers, from artisans. So this is a form of tax. But people would pay what they could to their king. And they paid it in kind, so they pay in heads of cattle, obviously, but also in provisions, in sheep, in clothing. Sometimes it would be even be paid in silver or gold if that is available. But the king would take what he could, or the king would accept what his people could give them as tribute on a yearly basis. And that's kind of how the king is able to support themselves. And I had mentioned that the king comes from this 4 generations of a royal family. So obviously they're coming from nobles and they have quite a bit of money themselves. But this extra form of revenue is another way of sort of supporting the appearance of the Tuwa and making sure that that king can represent them in style, if you will. And when I was discussing kings earlier yesterday in the lecture, I was mentioning how one re could be a client king to another, and that would be the re to a more. So the way that these kings can kind of solidify their alliances to one another is through gift giving, and then through also the exchange of hostages. So these client relationships are confirmed either through the gift of people or through gifts. So Ireland is actually known as a really heavily based gift giving culture. Affiliate, when they enter a household, would expect to be given some sort of gift from the patriarch of the family. That's sort of the element that we're talking about here. And tribute that these client kings can offer one another back and forth include wives, so a new wife. I heard you're recently divorced, here's my sister. Or here's a wife that I am interested in divorcing. She's a good wife, and here you go. But sometimes they would exchange things as in terms of like cattle, or even just intricately decorated jewelry, or things like that. The kingdom itself, though, as I was saying before, is not organized in the way that we think of cities today. It's very agrarian. And so I kind of want to talk a little bit about the landscape of Ireland for a little bit. So back when our first settlers that we know were in Ireland, so 7,000 BCE, archaeologists believe that Ireland was literally covered from almost stern to tip with trees. It is said that a squirrel could travel from the southern coast of Ireland all the way to the northern coast without ever having to touch the ground, because there's so much tree cover. Just very heavily wooded, dense forests. In between that, we have these vast peat bogs. There's mountains, hillsides, and then there is some land that is good for farming. But earlier on, there was only about 15% of the land that could have been used for arable agricultural farming. And this is one of the reasons why cattle and dairy farming really becomes the heart of the Irish agricultural system, is just because of the landscape that they're dealing with. And the food byproducts that we get from cattle make up the majority of the Irish diet. And they also become important bartering pieces in a coinless society. Besides cattle, we do also see pigs and sheep being valued. Sheep more for their wool than for their meat. And pigs were very easy to raise because they could essentially be turned loose in these giant forests and they would forage for themselves. Farming was very time consuming, and it wasn't considered as important as pastoral farming. Again, we're talking about a slightly nomadic society where they're moving with their herds. People who are obviously farming in those areas, they probably move a little bit less. But for the majority of the Irish we're talking about at this time period, there is a certain level of movement that is expected throughout the year, depending on the season. I'm going to talk a little bit about crops. And now on the slides that you're looking at, these maps here, the map on the right-hand side is more of a modern map. The Ireland that we're talking about now is far more densely forested. And so there isn't nearly as much of this arable land that we're talking about or grazing. But with the colonization that was done by the Normans and the English, we see the beautiful forests of Ireland being cut down and used as a commodity to be sold as a valuable resource. But at this time period, I do want you to keep in mind that it's a very forested area, which again goes hand in hand with kind of that the religious pagan faith, that a lot of their religious ceremonies are happening in these sacred groves, and the environment is really important. But some of the things that they do farm, again, there is arable lands they do farm. Because we're dealing with a wet climate of Ireland, the main crops that they grow are oats and barley, which are very hardy crops, and they can handle the cold climate of Ireland. Wheat is a very delicate, I don't know how many farmers we have in the group here, but wheat is a very delicate crop to harvest. And with the wet climate of Ireland, it's just not very dependable. It's just not hardy enough to survive the Irish cold and wet. But we also see a lot of vegetable gardens, fruit orchards. Beekeeping was also extremely common at this time period. Again, it was probably the only form of sweet that people would get, and the wax was very valuable. Before the 7th century AD, there doesn't seem to be any large farming settlements capable of supporting a fully settled community. And that's another reason why we think that there was so much nomadic travel, is that they went to the areas where there was food that they could harvest, and that their herds had new pastoral land to sort of eat and then move on to greener fields, if you will. So the Irish, as this nomadic people, would move with their herds from winter settlements to summer pastures and then back again. And so that's kind of that movement that we're talking about. And this is happening even in like the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. There's evidence of Irish nobles who are talking about moving from a winter house to a summer home, and that's because they're moving with their herds. And we're seeing that even in letters in the 15th century to Henry VIII, or the 16th century to Henry VIII. So when this movement is happening, people who remain because they are farming, they plow their fields, they plant them, and they harvest them during the spring and summer months. And then those fields act as winter pastures for the returning herds from the community. And then they're fed on the remaining harvest throughout the winter. This agrarian semi-nomadic lifestyle is part of the large reason, is part of the reason why large cities did not develop in Ireland until the 9th century or so, because of kind of this pattern. Their environment has a lot to do with it. So again, I feel like I've emphasized this, but you can't overemphasize the importance of cattle to the early Irish people. One's wealth is measured in cattle, and they're the main form of monetary exchange, as I mentioned before. I probably should have flipped this slide earlier, I apologize. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Toyne that I sent to everyone if you had a chance to read it. I know it was a lot. But the Irish folk story of the Toyne, also known as the Cattle Raid of Cooley, is a popular oral history tale that further emphasizes the importance of cattle to the early medieval Irish. The Toyne was probably written down in the 8th century AD, but it comes from a much, much earlier time. And it's part of the Ulster cycle of legends. And so there's a large group of oral history legends that are considered part of this Ulster cycle of legends. And it tells the story of the theft of a prize white bull. And the person who stole this bull is Queen Maeve. And she stole it from the people of Ulster, and subsequently a battle ensues to sort of retrieve this cattle, or to retrieve this prize bull. And so an entire war is fought over a bull, essentially. And the hero of this epic is Cuchulainn. And the story tells us that he is triple born. Again, we see this importance of threes with within Irish culture, that he has lineage to both man and the gods. But he defends his people while his own army is afflicted by this mysterious curse. They call him the pangs of Ulster. But this hero, we can kind of think of him as a Homeric hero, so kind of a Hector or even an Odysseus to a certain extent. Cuchulainn performs mighty deeds. He kills many, many members of Queen Maeve's army, even though he's suffering many wounds himself. He, in fact, even has to fight his own foster brother in this battle, and this battle with his foster brother lasts for 3 days. In the end, he ends up killing his brother, and Cuchulainn goes through like this huge mourning lament, and the story about that is really quite sad. And so after this battle, the Ulstermen have recovered from the pangs of Ulster, and they are then able to attack Maeve's army themselves and defeat Maeve's army. And so Cuchulainn is this hero who sort of rises up when the army couldn't fight themselves, and holds off the battle until they're able to come back. But this tale tells us so much more than just an interesting story. It tells us so much about Ireland's ancient past. It shows us about the society stratification, the hierarchy, the kings, noblemen, the court officials, this clan warfare that Ireland goes through. But it also talks about the use of fosterage to create goodwill between nobles. If you notice, I mentioned that he fought his foster brother, and fosterage is something that was very important in Ireland. A lot of times nobles would send their child to be fostered at another noble's household, and that would create, it's not a blood connection, but a familial connection. And it's just another way of sort of keeping those families connected and ensuring that we won't have clan warfare, at least to certain extents. The tale also tells us about different weapons that are used. It tells us so much about chariots and how chariots are used and how important they are. It tells us about Irish ideals of beauty, the importance of colors. And in that sense, when they're telling us about the importance of colors, we're learning the type of dyes that the Irish are able to get a hold of. So if someone is wearing a blue cloak, we know they must have access to a certain type of dye, lapis, that turns things blue. And so that tells us a little bit about trade and resources as well. And also that a person's rank can be determined by the colors that they're wearing. And that's interesting because we do see sumptuary laws throughout history that put limitations on the type of clothing or colors of clothing that people can wear, so that you can easily identify, well, that person's a noble and that person's obviously a serf or a doer because they're wearing drab clothing. And it shows us that these things are important even in BC Ireland. We also hear about gold and how it is highly coveted for jewelry, and the intricate designs that the Irish jewelers are able to create even at this early time. We hear about all of this from these stories. And it tells us about the forms of entertainment that the Irish had. Yes, we know that they have the traveling filiads and our traveling crooters, the harpists, but we also hear about the different sports that they play, the type of feasting that they do, swimming competitions. All of this sort of things are things you wouldn't expect you'd get from this story, but if you read it carefully, all of this kind of comes through. We also learned that genealogy is really important to the Irish. Knowing your past and your family's past is important. Remember when I was mentioning the Eris Dur, or excuse me, the Eris Dana, the class of academics, of artisans. To reach the highest level, you also have to have a high level of lineage. That's important as well. And that, again, it kind of feeds into this idea that genealogy is very important. Especially in pre-literate Ireland, it's important to have this record and for people to have that knowledge of it. So that's sort of that is kind of the end of this lecture on prehistory Ireland. I'm going to set the stage for what we're going to be dealing with next week. and then we can ask any questions if anybody has any. Uh, so we're talking about pre-Christian Ireland at this time, and pre-Christian Ireland and Ireland, pre-Christian Ireland is very different from the rest of pre-Christian Europe because Ireland went untouched by the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire got very close. They had every intention of invading Ireland. In fact, it was Julius Caesar who first called Ireland Hibernia, which is where we get that term from. But by the time the Romans had discovered that Ireland existed, they had already bitten off far more than they could chew with the size of their own empire and were just kind of imploding on themselves. And so they were never able to make that final journey over to Ireland. And so the Irish remained unmolested by the Romans, but they also didn't get some of the things that the Romans brought to these other cultures that they invaded. So a lot of the revolutionary advances that the Romans had, their road system, cities, agricultural technology, architectural technology, military, even governmental achievements, all of these things remained unknown to the Irish. Um, and they weren't involved in the trading networks in the same sense that the rest of Europe was involved in. We know for absolute sure that the Irish were trading with the Romans, but because there wasn't a Roman city or training base or fort in Ireland, we don't have that trade being solidified. We do have evidence of Roman coins in Ireland, evidence of Roman pottery, Roman armor. But remember, I have discussed how some of the warrior classes would go over and they would raid in Wales, they would raid in Scotland, they would raid in Cornwall. So they're interacting and they're perhaps taking some of these Roman coins back with them. And we'll learn in our story of St. Patrick that they took more than just Roman coins back with them to Ireland. But the Irish remained the masters of their own land. And because of this, they sort of remained the odd man out while the rest of Europe was flourishing under this Roman system. But because of that, they also didn't suffer when the Roman Empire collapsed.